Hey everybody, it's Paul Grossman, the Dark Arts Wizard, and I'm really happy to be here at Virtual Community Days, sponsored by Vivit and Unicom. And I hope you have your 3D goggles, your Oculus all set up in order to take a look at this wonderful stage in virtual reality. Oh, I can see a few of my friends sitting up there in the front row and a few in the back. Hey guys! All right, today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about UFT and the Magic Objects model and a couple other items along the way. A little bit about me. Well, if you want to get a hold of me, I'm on Twitter. I'm at the Dark Arts Wizard on Twitter. You can email me at thedarkartswizard@gmail.com. And if you want to see some of my cool videos that I do, check out my YouTube channel. Just type in there, Paul Grossman, the Dark Arts Wizard. You'll find it immediately. All right, going on here. A little bit about myself. I have been working as a test automation engineer for about 19 years, and about 16 years of those have been working in Micro Focus and HP tools. The last few years I've been working in Selenium, and I even get to play around with a bunch of other little tools, kind of like testRigor. My clients have ranged from medical to floral delivery to even Redbox, which was, I have to say, the most fun job I ever had in my life, and I hope someday maybe I'll be able to do it again. Who knows? I hope you get a chance to have a job that is just so much fun. Today, I'm actually working at Utopia Solutions. That's their CEO is Lee Barnes. And if that name sounds familiar, it should be because he's also a conference speaker. And I highly recommend you go check him out, search him up, and take a look at some of his presentations because he is a brilliant, brilliant speaker. Moving on. What are we going to get out of this session? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about natural language processing, that's NLP, and the magic object model. I'm going to show you some code that's written in Java, Selenium. If you like Java, if you like VB script, I'm going to show you some stuff that's in UFT. I'm not going to get too deep into it. And then, of course, we need to have a demo. So we're going to have an NLP demo, and we're going to use testRigor to show how easy and fast it is in order to do natural language processing with a good test automation tool. So our major thing, this whole puzzle here piece is going to be working on plain English commands. All right, so a little bit of background on where we started on this. What happens when a link anchor element, its property changes? You know, if one property you can't identify because the property slightly changed, that's an easy fix. You just change the identifier in the property. But what if the class changes? It's no longer a link, it's now a button. That's a little bit harder, and it's kind of difficult in UFT because what happens is that you have to replace the element and put in a brand new element, which is no longer a link, it's now a button. And then anywhere that you're referencing that button, you have to replace that code. This actually happened to me on a project I was working on. It was a project that had been in flight for about 6 months before I arrived. It was one of the early ones, and there was a lot of copy and paste. So when they found that there were about 50 links that had been changed, we were thinking we had going to have to add another element to a button element and then find every reference to that button element. And that's like 200 lines of code to go fix. That is going to be a nightmare. That would have been taking us, we estimate, about 2 days worth of maintenance. That would have been a killer. So I came up with this idea of class switching, which is to dynamically replace a link with a button if you couldn't find it, the link in the first place, and just do that on the fly. We were able to get that solution within 2 hours, which was great because my boss really wanted to see some results. He was used to seeing results within 2 hours of running all of our tests. We had 100 that were there, and almost all of them failed except for the login. That wasn't too impressive. Within 2 hours, got 95 of our test cases up and running. The last 5, well, 2 of them had elements that just didn't work with this little trick, but in the other last 3 were actually defects, which was the number of defects that we found every time we ran a release. Now, following that, I thought, well, wait a second. If I can actually find an element that way, maybe I could actually convert plain English into an element to go find it. It's like, let's say I want to click on the add cart link. Well, this I started playing around with this in Selenium, and over here it's in UFT. So left-hand side, Selenium, folks. Right-hand side, UFT, folks. And on this, we wanted to go and parse out the elements of the text and then translate it into code, creating an XPath with a link like an A with the text of the link that we were looking for, like add to cart here, and then go and get a bunch of elements and then find one that actually had some width, some visibility, and go click on it. Now there's one more trick with this code, which is this elements click down here. You might think we'd have to replace every click with a click method. So in UFT, there's actually a really simple way of forcing every click that you've got to do whatever code that you actually want to do. You would create your own function like click advanced over here, and then add in, let's say I want to do a synchronization of the page after every click so that I don't overrun the execution, and then use register user function with a web button click advanced true. But you don't need to necessarily know how to write that code, because in UFT there's a real simple way of doing it. You go under design and go to your function definition, and you say, what's the name of my function? Well, it was click advanced, and I want to register it to a test object, and I don't want an ActiveX, I want a web button. And we want this to be registered as the default operation. Look, the code you create is right there, and if I hit OK, it just pops right in, and then we can add in the description font methods that we wanted to add, as I just mentioned. The test object click, which came from over here, and the browser, which is synchronizing right after the click. And with this register user function already put in there, now our advanced click version is going to replace any place that we actually have a physical click on an element. Now you might be thinking, wow, that would probably be impossible to try and break up a whole sentence and find an element and create some code. So it turns out it's really not all that difficult. Over here, we have code for doing that parse, basically splitting up into a words array. Same thing over here in VB script, creating an array of words based on splitting up the sentence. The sentence automatically divides by a single space. So let's take a look. Some common things that we might do. Click on the add to cart link. Well, this would break down into about 6 different elements: verbs, articles, element names, and this actually became fairly easy to identify and build a framework out of this. So let's take a look at individually what gets broken down when we go through this. First of all, we have clicking on the add to cart link. So this is a verb. The first word always is a verb: a click, a select, enter something into a field, marking check boxes and radio boxes, clearing them, and asserting some sort of value. Now that's where we get a little bit tricky, because asserts will have a couple of different things we might want to do. Like an assert might say, let's see if something exists or doesn't exist. Contains or doesn't contain the value is a field that's enabled or disabled, a checkbox that's marked or cleared, and whether it actually exists, equals, or is equal to, is greater than or less than if we're doing some sort of fancy multiplication. So we've got our verb taken care of. Click and select is out of the way. The next thing is we would go and look for those articles. Those are the words like on, the, into, if we want to enter something into, select something from a drop-down list. And in that case, we just throw it away. We don't need those. It's of no use to us. What's our next bit? Well, we want to convert our element type to an XPath. And the interesting thing is, in plain English, you might say it's a link or it's a button or a field, but of course in the DOM, you've got an anchor, a button, or an input field. And even when it comes down to text, some of these are going to have multiple ways that you might want to have to find an element. A text could be a span, a div, a paragraph, a label, or even H1, H2, H3. That gets a little bit more tricky. Tabs, anchor or a span. And also notice this: a link may not necessarily be a link. A link may be a button, and a button may be a link. So we might want to have to do some class switching, like we talked about on that earlier slide. All right, so now we've got the element figured out, what that's going to be, like our list and our field. The next thing is we need to find out what is the text that is being used to identify which one we're looking for. And we could do that in a couple ways. You could basically, anything that's to the left of wherever we found the element is going to be that descriptor. Add to cart list, month list. first name field. First name field over here. So we basically anything to our left is our descriptor that gets our item. And then we want to click on the last thing is whatever's left. What do we have left here? Here we're selecting May from the month list. Well, in this case, this becomes our data that we are doing. We're either pulling our data and validating it, or we are going to look for it. So in this case, if it was a month list, we're looking for May inside of the months to be there. If I'm putting something into a first name field, well, whatever's left over here, Paul is my name that I'm going to put into that field. And even at our asserts, the only thing that's left over here is one word, contains. And contains is works with assert to tell us, okay, I need to assert that one of these types of assertions are going on. It contains it. It's the element is enabled, disabled. And once that's taken care of, the last thing we've got over there is the text that says, hey, we're looking for Paul. And of course, the best thing to do here is to put that into single quotes so that you can identify it from the rest of the field. So our last thing is, like I said, our data that we're going to get populated in here. Select May from the field, enter Paul into the first name field, and assert that the first name contains Paul. Here we're actually putting in my name, so we might be going through this whole thing, asserting the first name field contains Paul right over here. All right, so the next thing is to dynamically build those XPath locators. We're going to get a little deep into some code. Here's the Selenium version right there for you. We've already figured out the XPath. So we've got 2 slashes in our element type, which is going to be our link A. We're clicking on that add to cart link. And then we want to see if it contains a text. We're making that generic. We could leave off contains and just say the text equals our identifier. Either way will do. But this is just a little bit more generic, a little more flexibility in our code. Then we create our XPath by passing in the XPath and creating a by locator, and then coming back with a list of elements that fit the by locator from the XPath. And then the last thing we want to do is get the count of how many elements did this actually return to us. Now, this is the exact same thing, except we're doing it in VB script over here. Same thing, XPath equals our string over here. And then we're getting an element from our browser where we get the children based on XPath. A little bit simpler, a little bit easier to go through, not quite as many lines of code to do that. And again, same thing, the count elements gets us the elements count on that. What do we do from that? We're all done, right? Now, we've got one more thing to do is we want to search for visible elements. So we don't want an invisible one. How do we go and do that? Well, we go through each one of our elements in our collection that we found and look to see if they have a width that's greater than 0. If you don't like width, try height. That will work as well. You don't necessarily have to do both of them. It's kind of a belt and suspender sort of thing. But width will give you a good identifier of whether your element that you're working with is actually visible and interactive from the user's standpoint. If it's visible, once we go through, we find the first visible one. And if it is visible, we set the visible to true over here. This is becoming set to true. This is also being set over here to true or false. And the next thing is, if it's visible, then go through our verbs. What are we going to do with that particular element? Are we going to click on it? Are we going to verify it? Are we going to select it? All sorts of things. And again, we have our element over here we're going to click, and that is another custom method that would have a little bit more safeguards in there, just checking to make sure that the page is built before we go and click on it, or even wait for the page to be built after we click on it. We never want to do a element.click because there's other stuff that we need to kind of handle as we do those actions. All right, now, what if we have no visible elements? Getting back to our first slide, class switching. Let's say our count of elements that we got back from the collection was 0. And the reason being is that ain't no button. And the reason being is that is not a link over there. That's actually a button behind the scenes. So if our count of elements is 0 for a link, let's change our element type to button and do the exact same XPath. get the element type, which is now an XPath of a button that contains add to cart, and then go and get the collection of our elements. So that's our class switching automatically in case we can't find the exact element that we're looking for. And we go through and then again go and find the visible element that will show us which one is the current and visible to our user. All right. One question you might have at this point, we've gotten all the way through this and explained just the majority of the concepts in Magic Object Model design, is great. Does this replace the page object model, or does it replace the object repository in UFT? The answer to that one is absolutely not. What I'm looking at is that we could use the Magic Object Model to try and find an element. And we would only do that if we weren't reliably finding it. We would have still a page object model that says, oh, if you can find this in the page object model, that's great, that's an element. And if it's not listed in there, go use the Magic Object Model to go and find the elements that we are looking to interact with. That would reduce the number of elements in our object repository and also reduce the amount of maintenance that we're doing on dynamic elements that are changing all the time if our code can be smart enough to interact with a dynamic changing element. So at this point we say, well, that's cool. Do you have a demo that actually could do this? So I'm going to go and show you how testRigor does this and creates plain English. I've got a testRigor add-on that I'm going to start with a new recording, and it's going to record this description, the test step candy mapper demo, and this is what the steps are going to look like. Enter hello into an enter message, submit, click, press on submit, and we'll walk that through. And by the way, you can put into all sorts of different types of test suites, and this one I'm going to be putting into my candy mapper prod. So let's hit the start new recording, and we're going to start recording right from this particular site here, the Candy Mapper. The first thing is we have a pop-up challenge. We're going to just go and close the pop-up. And the next thing is step 2, we're going to click on Get in Touch. The third step is we're going to put in my name, Paul, and then I'm going to click Send. Now, Send is going to generate a message because we didn't actually put in an email address, a valid email address. And that's what I want to validate that actually popped up. So I'm going to put in my email address, thedarkartswizard@gmail.com. And I'll even put in a message over there. Hello. Hello. And I'll even put in a message in there. Hello. testRigor. We'll put that in there. And I'm going to click on Send. And the next thing I want to do is validate that I actually got a message that said, thank you for your inquiry. We will be back with you in 48 hours. That's all my tests is. We've done a positive and a negative test. I'm going to stop my recording now and take a look at what got generated. Under here you can see, well, we closed that pop-up, but we had some interesting little weird stuff that popped up in there. We'll get back to that in just a moment. We're going to go and click on Get in Touch, so it picked up on that. We're going to enter Paul into name, click on the Send, and then we clicked on Please enter a valid email address. Now, I don't really want to click on it. What I want to do is to check page contains. We'll do that. And in fact, I'm going to take a copy of that because I may need that in someplace else. All right. And then we're going to go enter my email into the email. We're going to enter in hello testRigor into message, click on send. And then again, our last step is to verify that we saw this information. Cool. Let's go to add that and then run it. We have a new test case created, and we're going to watch it execute as it goes along. We'll add and run. We'll go over to testRigor, and we see that we have a test case that's been added. And the test is beginning, and so we have a question mark indicating that we haven't taken any screen captures as of yet. There is our pop-up, and we're clicking on the description of the pop-up. It clears, and then it starts taking screen captures as we go along just to do our validations. Notice I can click on Get in Touch, and this will give us a large image and a purple outline indicating which element it actually clicked. And as we go through the test, we can see that it's completed all the way to the end and even validated that there is text on the screen. Cool. Now there's a couple things we need to do to modify this test case. I'm going to go and edit the test case. And the first thing is that pop-up. This isn't all that descriptive. So what I'm going to do is I am going to replace that. We're going to say in plain English, click the first button on the right top of the pop-up challenge. And by the way, if you hit my website twice on the browser, the second time it won't come up. So I'm going to say if exists. Now the last trick I want to do is I would like to have my email generate a random number of numbers each time it runs. Let's say about 10 of those. Now to do this, we just simply go over to the help, and a sample of the code to do this is actually listed right here. Generate by regex, and you just need to know 2 or 3 little regex tricks. This is creating a string that is a random lowercase letters or lower and numbers, and then we want to do it 30 times. So this creates one random character 30 times over. I'm only going to want 10, and it is using a backslash, and that is basically telling that the @ sign is a special character, not to interpret it as a regex. Same thing with the period over here. It's saying don't interpret that as a dot, interpret that as a literal period. And we could even save this out as a variable, but for this demo purposes, we're not going to need to do that. So let me go back over to our script, and I'm going to replace this line here with our version, and we'll walk that through. It's going to say generate by regex the Dark Arts Wizard. That's my email. Here is a plus sign, which is also another regular expression, so we're going to escape it. We're going to create random numbers from 0 through 9. We're going to make 10 of those, and we're going to do it to my Gmail account and then enter that into the email field. Let's upload that and give it another retest and see what happens. All right, it's right now trying to figure out what is where that little pop-up is going to be dealt with. We needed to, remember, close that upper right-hand corner up there, and it figured it out. It said, yeah, I know exactly what you're looking for, and it got that little square. So that is in plain English. Pretty cool. And the other item we want to do is take a look at our email. So there's our email. We'll open it up, and let's take a little look at that. And sure enough, it has created our email with random numbers inside of it. Again, plain English for creating our emails. There's some other areas we might want to take a look at and see if they're actually supported inside of testRigor. Like, could you take all of your sentences, if they're doing the same thing over and over again, like a login or getting an item from a cart, could you put them into reusable components? And absolutely, it's called rules up there, but you can take your rules and reuse them and call them in multiple test cases. So let's say you had a login for an admin, and that admin's username or password happens to change. You just change it in the subroutine, in the rule, and every test that calls it will actually go out and reuse and log in with the new account. You don't have to change everything that's in there. It's always, that reusable design is always a good thing to have in your automation framework. Grabbing values and saving them off in a variable and then reusing them somewhere else. That's just basically variable use. Extracting out values based on a regular expression. You can actually send emails and check emails in the cloud. It'll go out to a server and then go validate what it received. One of the other ones I wanted to mention is that relative element location. Now that is actually already part of Selenium. It just got introduced in Selenium 4 last year. However, UFT has had it for almost 7 years inside of its application. And guess what? testRigor has it as well. You can see the descriptions that you can use in the middle of a screen, to the left, to the right, second from the bottom. One other item I'm going to put in there is that you can also generate today's date, yesterday's date, tomorrow's, all sorts of different ways of putting in dates and hours and minutes based on what your test case requires. All right, I hope you enjoyed that demo and some of the features of testRigor. We're going to get on with our presentation, but if you do want to know more about that, check out testRigor at testRigor.com. Now we get up to the one section of the presentation I always love to do, and that is thinking outside the box. Starting off with showing you the fastest way that you can populate a field, and then we'll also talk about how to determine if your page is done building. Let's take a look at send keys. This is pretty standard over here. I've got some text. Paul, I want to put it into a field over here, right? And so I'm going to go use this particular approach. There are several different ways of doing this. This one I'm going to use the actions in driver in Selenium. And I'm going to set focus on this to put our focus on this element. And then we're going to send keys to the element. Also, you could have the input field inside of the action as well. That's perfectly a normal, fine too. And but it has nothing to do with the speed and how fast we can put stuff in there. Because if I'm putting in 4 characters, yeah, that's no big deal. But if you have 500 characters and you're trying to fill up an entire text area element and you got 500 characters in there, this may not be the fastest way to do it. So let me show you a little trick that I like to do. I like to go and get the clipboard and add that into my code. And then my text, you're going to see the text gets put into a string selection text. You need that. And then we populate that into the clipboard contents. If you were to execute this code and get to this point and do a Control V, you'd be pasting Paul wherever you happen to want to put it because it's sitting in your clipboard. Next, we go to our actions and we are clicking on this, and we are going to also need to make sure that we don't end up repopulating whatever text is in there. I want to clear this out. So I've added one little trick over here, is that I'm sending a keys chord with a Control and an A. We all know what Control A does when you type it on the keyboard, right? It selects all. So if we do this and then do send text, that will go and replace whatever happens to be in that field. But that's not the fastest way to do it. The fastest way you could do it is to select Control All and then put a Control V after that. Because we just took all that text and put it into the clipboard, you'd figure I'd need to use that. And instead of sending keys or text, just do a Control V and paste your text into your field wherever you're going. Let's go on next to a dynamic weight. Sure, there's lots of ways you can sit there and see if your element exists or doesn't exist and all that stuff, but usually what I do is that whenever I have clicked on an element, clicked on a button, the page is automatically rebuilding. Now, if you immediately go to try and go find an element right after you did a click, well, your page is rebuilding, and maybe you're going to have to go through all these little gyrations to see if it exists, if it's enabled, if it's all that stuff. You can do that, but it can take some time. Add this in here and you'll get a lot more reliable, faster responses from this. So let me walk you through this. This is my page sync method. We're starting off with 3 different variables. They're all integers. Last count, which is the count of how many elements were found the last time we went through this loop we'll talk about in a moment. Then we have count, which is the count of the elements that we found in the current loop. And then retry was how many times they're going to keep trying this. You'll understand this in a moment here. We go through a do loop, and we're going to do up to 3 times. We're going to try and retry this up to 3 times, and we go and get the count of how many elements are on the page. Now, this I like for speed in Selenium, because what I'm really looking for is all the links in our page. If you got a web page, more than likely you got links in there. And usually links are populated at the very bottom with all the copyright and all that stuff down there. So If those are being built and completed, more likely your page is done and you can go on and work and try and interact with your actual element you're looking for. That's through the find elements with a by path that we're going through on that. If I want to do it in Selenium, well, use a description, object description, which is kind of the equivalent of the by on Selenium side. You go through the description. Now, this one's a little bit different. I'm just doing a description create. You could add another line that says, hey, go get the links. But in this case, I've left that off, and I'm just passing in an empty description element. And it goes and gets the child objects, which is the same as find elements. These two lines do the exact same thing. They bring back a collection of objects, and then we get the count. We count how many objects did we get. Over here we have count, and count equals how many objects did we get. And we go through our if statement. If this current count matches the last count, and the first time through they won't match because we've only gone through it once. If they do match, then we take the retry and we bring it down a peg from 3 down to 2. And if they don't match, if they do not match, well, then we set the last count to equal to the current count so that we can remember it, and then we reset our retry over to 3. So basically the upshot of this is it goes through this loop 3 times. It takes about 3/4 of a second in order to execute all this. You could put a wait statement or a thread sleep for 1/4 of a second and have it go through 3 times, but honestly, the execution of this is about 1/4 of a second to go get all those elements from the system. You go through it 3 times, and if after 3 attempts the numbers are exactly the same, the counts are all the same, you drop out. You're pretty much done. If for any reason those first 2 counts don't match up, then we reset our retry and we say, okay, we've had 2 successful attempts. Now let's go to 3. We wait for 3 more attempts. So, all right, well, we've gotten down to the end of the presentation. We'll have some Q&A in just a moment, but I did want to mention that there are a couple of wonderful podcasts out there. You all know Jonathan Wright. He is the head of the QA Lead Out There podcast. Do check him out. He interviews really, really brilliant people. I love listening to his podcast. There's another guy out there, Joe Colantoni, who does the Automation Guild. And he also interviews people on test automation in different areas. So another brilliant podcast. If you get some downtime, do it. I also recommend getting some books like Continuous Testing for DevOps Professional. That's by Aaron Kinsberner. And it's got a whole bunch of other people who have contributed to that book, sharing their brilliance on it. Definitely something to read. And The Complete Guide to Test Automation. And that's by Arnon Axelrod. And, I say, get the books, right? He talks the talk, but does he walk the walk? Of course he does. I have actual physical books that I keep inside my room. And this is one by Joe. And in fact, if I dig a little bit deeper, you'll actually see The Complete Guide to Test Automation. If I needed to learn a new programming language, well, I go and get myself my head start for Java. If I needed to learn Angular, well, I can get Angular books on that. And even if I needed to know how to getting started with testng in Selenium, that's a great book. That's by Rex Jones over here. You should know Rex. He's very, very well known. And if you want to go really old school, Selenium Simplified, and that is Alan Richardson. So yes, I do walk the walk. I do talk the talk. We're out of time, so let's get on to some Q&A. Thank you very much for watching the presentation. Have yourself a great day. Questions, please.